We all have those childhood memories, right? The ones that stick with you. Not always the happy ones, the ones that linger, the ones that still kind of make you shiver. And that's what we're looking at today. Stories you guys requested. About those unsettling childhood memories.
Yeah, the ones where things get a little creepy.
Exactly. Like when something ordinary, something familiar, suddenly becomes ominous.
It's that contrast that really gets under your skin, isn't it? Like the safe world of childhood, suddenly warped by something dark. And what's fascinating is how these memories stick with people, how they shape them even decades later.
So let's dive into the first story, Blacktop Road. Takes us to small-town Indiana, 1993. Our narrator, we'll call him David, is 12 years old and obsessed with bike racing. His best friend Kevin is the daredevil, always pushing the limits. But David, he's a little more cautious.
Always the one pumping the brakes.
Yeah, exactly. While Kevin's flying down some hill without a care in the world.
That difference in their personalities, it's really important, especially when you consider where they're having these races.
Blacktop Road.
Right. Not an official name or anything, more like a local legend, This cracked, overgrown road leading into the woods. It's practically a character in itself.
And not a very friendly character.
No, not at all.
David describes it as cold, heavy. The air is thick with this almost sweet smell of decay. Pretty creepy, right?
Definitely gives you the chills just thinking about it. But for Kevin, it's a thrill. He loves the isolation, the feeling of pushing boundaries, almost like he's drawn to that same darkness that David avoids.
Okay, so picture this. It's a late September evening. Air is crisp, leaves starting to turn. David and Kevin are having their usual race. First one to the streetlight at the end of Blacktop wins. But something's different this time. David's actually winning.
And that right there, that's a brilliant bit of foreshadowing. Kevin, the daredevil, always wins. Him losing, even if it seems small at the time, immediately sets up this sense of unease, like something's off.
And it's not just that he's losing. David looks back and sees Kevin grinning, pushing hard, but there's this weird tightness in his eyes, almost like he's holding something back.
Could be tension, sure, determination. But knowing what happens next, it takes on a whole different meaning, doesn't it? Like maybe Kevin saw something in those woods, something that scared even him.
David bursts out of the woods, feeling that rush of victory, but then he waits and waits. The sun starts to set, the shadows get longer, and Kevin doesn't appear.
Taps into that primal fear, right? Being alone in the dark, knowing something's wrong, but not knowing what, especially for a kid who's already uneasy about the place.
Absolutely. David's paralyzed with fear, but eventually runs home and tells his parents. The search for Kevin begins. The next day, they find his bike, twisted and abandoned deep in the woods, his jacket snagged on a branch. But Kevin, gone.
The bike, the jacket, they're proof something happened.
Yes.
They just add to the mystery, fuel the fear. What happened to Kevin? Where did he go? It's the lack of answers that really gets to you.
And David's plagued by guilt. What if he had slowed down? What if he had turned back? But years later, a new, even more disturbing thought takes root. He remembers seeing a shape in the woods sometimes, a dark figure looking just beyond the trees.
That's where the story shifts. It goes from a missing person case to something more supernatural. Like there might be something malevolent in those woods, something David glimpsed but never fully acknowledged.
And then he remembers something else, something that changes everything. Kevin let him win that race.
Whoa! For a competitive kid like Kevin, that's totally out of character. It suggests he knew something David didn't. Maybe he saw that figure in the woods and knew David was in danger.
So he let David win, made sure he got out of those woods, and in doing so, maybe
he sacrificed himself, a terrifying thought. But it completely changes how we see the story. It's not just a vanishing, it's an act of courage, of friendship. And it leaves us wondering what was lurking in those woods. What did Kevin see that was so terrifying he was willing to risk his own life to save his friend?
It's a chilling thought. That Kevin might have made a choice, a sacrifice, to protect his friend. Makes those woods, that road, even more unsettling.
Yeah, because it implies that something was waiting there, something that chose David. And that just raises even more questions, like what if we aren't just dealing with the unexplained, but with something intentionally malevolent?
Okay, so let's move on to our second story, the Nutcracker. It's Christmas Eve, blizzard raging outside, fire crackling inside. The perfect setting for a cozy family holiday, right?
That's sure perfect.
But this story takes that warmth, that familiar Christmas feeling, and twists it into something unsettling.
It's a classic horror move, isn't it? Using that contrast. You have the safe, familiar setting, and then the lurking darkness, like in those old fairy tales. The woods are supposed to be magical, wondrous, but they become places of danger, of deception.
Right, exactly. So our narrator, Sarah, is 10 years old. Her little brother, Max, is 6. And they have this new tradition, opening one present early on Christmas Eve. Max gets to go first, and he unwraps this big, shiny red box inside. A brightly painted wooden nutcracker grinning from ear to ear.
The nutcracker itself, that's an interesting choice. Symbolically, I mean, it's a traditional Christmas decoration, right? Often associated with childhood wonder, fantasy. But there's also something unnerving about them. Those rigid features, that fixed grin, the sharp teeth, almost like a mask hiding something sinister.
And right from the start, there's something off about this particular nutcracker. Neither of the parents bought it. They have no idea where it came from.
Which immediately makes you wonder, introduces this element of mystery, of the unknown. The gift, it seems innocent enough, but suddenly it's not. Where did it come from, and why was it given to Max?
But Max is totally smitten. He names the nutcracker Mr. Cracks and insists on keeping it in his room. Later that night, the storm gets worse. The power goes out, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah wakes up to the sound of creaking floorboards. Footsteps. She peeks into the hallway and sees nothing. But Max's door is open.
The storm, the darkness, the isolation, it all adds to this growing sense of vulnerability, like you're cut off from the outside world. Perfect conditions for fear to take root.
She goes to check on Max and finds him sitting up in bed, terrified, staring at the corner of the room. And guess what's standing there? The nutcracker. Its grin somehow wider in the shadows.
The way it seems to move on its own, the grin widening, it's like it's aware, It's not just a toy anymore, it's active.
And neither of them moved it. Sarah tries to comfort Max, tells him it's just his imagination. But she can't shake this feeling that something's wrong. The next morning, Max doesn't come downstairs for breakfast. Sarah hears her mother scream and rushes to his room, only to find him dead.
That's effective, isn't it? That shift. It goes from unsettling to horrific, just like that. Plays on your expectations. You think you're safe then. Bam!
He's lying in bed, face contorted in terror, clutching the blanket like he's trying to ward off something unseen. And the nutcracker. Still grinning on the nightstand.
And now the nutcracker takes on a whole new meaning, doesn't it? Is it just a witness to this tragedy? Or is it somehow responsible?
Sarah's dad is just frozen. Her mom, she's overcome with grief, with rage. She immediately blames the nutcracker, sees it as cursed, the cause of Max's death, orders her husband to get rid of it, to burn it.
It's a primal reaction, isn't it, to grief? The need to find an explanation, to blame something, especially when faced with something as inexplicable as the death of a child.
They watch the nutcracker burn in the fireplace. Desperate to erase it, but you can't burn away grief, can you? They bury Max on New Year's Eve, and the nutcracker becomes this unspoken taboo. No one mentions it. The Christmas Eve tradition, it's abandoned. Years go by, and you'd think that would be the end of it, right?
We want closure, don't we? Especially when we've experienced trauma. But some wounds, some fears, they run deeper than we realize.
Sarah grows up, has a family of her own. But the memory of that Christmas Eve, of Max and the nutcracker, it never fully fades. And then comes the twist. She's unpacking Christmas decorations with her daughter and tucked away in a dusty box in the attic.
It's like the return of the repressed. The things we try to bury, to forget, they have a way of coming back when we least expect it.
She finds the nutcracker, grinning up at her.
And suddenly, all those years of buried grief, of unanswered questions, they come flooding back. Was the nutcracker truly malevolent? Is it attached to Sarah somehow? Or is it, as you said before, a manifestation of her guilt, her grief? The story leaves us with that chilling uncertainty.
It's like they say, right? The things that scare us the most are the ones we can't explain. And both of these stories, they really leave us hanging with so many questions.
But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe they're not trying to give us answers. Maybe they're just exploring the nature of fear itself, how it sticks with us, how it can shape us, and how sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can only kind of glimpse, the things that lurk just beyond our understanding.
Yeah, I mean, in Blacktop Road, we're left wondering, what was in those woods? Was it a creature, some kind of spirit, or was it just David's own fear, amplified by the darkness, the isolation?
And the story never tells us, does it? It lets us fill in the blanks, which is almost scarier in a way. We're forced to face our own fears, our own interpretations.
And then there's the nutcracker with that ending, the toy showing up again years later. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more going on, something Attached to Sarah, maybe? Drawn to her grief?
It makes you think about those stories about cursed objects, doesn't it? The idea that everyday things can become vessels for something darker, something beyond our control. And because we never really know the truth about the nutcracker, it taps into that fear of the unknown, the idea that even the things we think are safe, familiar, they can turn on us.
Both stories are about being chosen too, aren't they? David feels like H.E. was the target that night on Blacktop Road. And Sarah, she's haunted by the nutcracker coming back specifically for her, that grin directed right at her.
Right, it's that primal fear, the fear of being watched, being singled out by something we don't understand, something potentially dangerous. And it's interesting that in both stories, the main characters, they're children when these things happen. There's a sense of vulnerability, of powerlessness, which just makes the fear that much stronger.
Because as kids, we're more open to suggestion, right? To the power of stories, of imagination. But what if those stories, those fears, what if they're more than just our imagination? What if they're glimpses into something real, something we haven't figured out yet?
That's a chilling thought, isn't it? That our childhood fears, the nightmares, maybe they're reflections of a reality we just haven't grasped yet.
Well, I know I'm going to be listening a little closer to those creaking floorboards at night. And maybe double-checking the attic just to make sure there aren't any grinning nutcrackers hiding up there.
Probably a good idea. But maybe the biggest takeaway from all this is never underestimate the power of fear, especially the fears that stay with us from childhood. Maybe they're trying to tell us something.
And to everyone listening, have you ever had an experience, even something small, that made you question what's really out there? Something that gave you chills, something you couldn't quite explain? Let us know. We'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, sleep tight.
Maybe. Leave a light on.